So like he said, my name is Jenny. I work for the San Mateo County Department of Agriculture, and I'm going to go over pesticide laws and regulations. So the California Department of Pesticide Regulation is the state level enforcement of pesticide laws and regulations. And then each county has a Department of Agriculture that is the local enforcement on the ground. So in my presentation, I'm going to walk you through a pesticide use monitoring inspection so you know what to expect if you see us out there. Then I will go over the most common violations that we find. And then I will touch on the second generation rodenticide prohibitions that were talked about in length earlier. So I'm glad that was done in detail. So you might recognize this guy. He is your county ag inspector. We have several throughout the county. See, you might see this guy around. We do surveillance of pesticide use monitoring. So, you know, there'll be days that we just go out and look for people who are using pesticides, and then we will, you know, approach you, introduce ourselves, tell you that we work for the county and that we're going to perform a use monitoring inspection. And of course, right now we are wearing masks to protect you and us against COVID. And we'll also be using, you know, physical distancing, and we'll avoid touching anything. So for example, you know, usually we'll ask you to see a label of the product you're using. We may just have you set it down and walk away so that we can look at it and just avoid any contact there. So when would we perform a use monitoring inspection? Basically, whenever you are handling pesticides. So are you mixing and loading, transferring, any applications, servicing or cleaning equipment, or working with open containers. So that's how we would recognize that, you know, it's a good time for us to do an inspection. And of course, if you're doing any of these activities, then all of the regulations kick in. So during a pesticide use monitoring inspection, we are looking for, you know, general safety to make sure that you're doing everything within the law. So the four main categories that we're looking at are PPE, labeling, safety, and storage. So the first thing that's most obvious is the PPE, or your personal protective equipment. And PPE actually falls in under two separate regulations. So what is required by the regulation, that's the California Code of Regulations 6738, and then what is required by the label. And these could be different. So you need to be aware of both requirements. So under California Code of Regulations 6738, when you are handling pesticides, so doing any of those activities that I mentioned before, the mix load, the application, you're required to wear chemical resistant gloves. And in general, they need to be 14 mils thick or thicker. And then the second requirement under that California Code of Regulation is the eye protection. And the eye protection needs to be, I believe that's a OSHA, sorry, I don't know where that regulation comes from, but it's the NZZ87, so that protective eyewear. So I know that many municipalities are now moving away from using glyphosate, which is a caution material. And whether, you know, if some of those replacement materials that you're using are warning or danger, mostly warning signal words. So you need to be aware that if you're using a material that has a warning or danger signal word, that it requires the use of coveralls. And coveralls are defined as a 1 or 2 piece garment made of closely woven fabric that covers the entire body except the head, hands, and feet. And the coveralls must be provided by the employer as PPE. So the coveralls are not something that you would, you know, wear to work and take home with you. They would be provided by the employer and stay at work, washed by the employer. So what PPE is required by the label? That requires reading the label. And the most general requirements usually are a long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes, and socks. You know, depending on what you're using, it may require eye protection, the chemical resistant gloves, which is, you know, same as the California code. And then you need to read to find out if there are different PPE requirements for the mix load or the application, because sometimes it may say when the handler is mixing and loading that he or she needs to wear a chemical resistant apron. It may require respiratory protection, or it may require chemical resistant boots. When you're choosing your gloves, so remember, gloves are always required when handling pesticides under that California Code of Regulations. We have this little key card, and so the label may specify what type of gloves are required when handling that pesticide, or it may just give you a category under what's required by EPA. So it may say, you know, handler must wear gloves that fall under category C. And then you can use this key card to see which numbers. You have label code C here. And all of the acceptable types of materials of gloves would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, or 8, which are listed here. There is, so for and like I mentioned before, they all need to be 14 mils or thicker. There is an exception you can see at the bottom of this selection key for laminate and polyethylene. Those do not require the 15 or the 14 mil thickness. And if the label does not specify the material of the gloves to be used, then you can use rubber, neoprene, or other chemical resistant gloves. So when choosing your protective eyewear, if it's not specified by the label, then you should use at least the safety glasses that have the face, brow, and temple protection. If the label specifies what to use, so say the label specifies that the handler must wear goggles when handling the pesticide, then the handler must wear goggles or a more protective form of protection. The handler cannot use a less protective form of eye protection. And again, a reminder, they need to be the NZZ 87 high impact American standard for protection. Sunglasses don't work. There are sunglasses that are Z87, but it needs to say that specifically. Okay, so for personal protective equipment, I just wanted to remind everyone that the regulation is written as the employer shall, so it really falls on the employer to ensure that everything that's required in that regulation is being followed. And I know that's not easy because usually the employer is not out in the field with the employee to ensure that they're doing all these things, but that's something that needs to be clarified in the training. But the responsibility does fall on the employer to provide all the required PPE. So that's all the PPE that's required by regulation or the label. The employer shall assure that there's daily inspection and cleaning of the PPE. So if there's any potential contamination of the, say they're using coveralls or the gloves, those need to be cleaned before the next use. And the employer shall repair or replace damaged or contaminated PPE. So you can see these gloves here on the left are a bit damaged. They will not provide protection for the handler, so those need to be replaced. The employer shall assure that PPE is stored correctly, and I'll go over this later, but in general, the PPE, clean PPE must be stored separately from any pesticides. So if you in your truck or actually at the yard or wherever you start your day, PPE cannot be stored in the same location as pesticides. So the employer shall assure that the PPE is used correctly and for its intended use. I guess that means, if you provide safety glasses or safety eyewear to your employees, having those up on your top of your head is not the correct use. They need to be worn, as glasses are intended to be worn. The employer shall keep and wash potentially contaminated PPE. Like I mentioned before, that's for the coverall. If you're using a warning or danger material and the coverall requirement kicks in, those are the responsibility of the employer to keep and wash those. And assure that the employees do not take potentially contaminated PPE home. And that's for, the protection of the employee and their family or whoever they live with. Okay, so the next kind of category during a pesticide use monitoring inspection is labeling. So we're looking for the registered label of the product, the proper use, the labeling, the site and the rate, pesticide container labeling, and service container labeling. So you are required to have the registered label of the product that you are handling or using. And it must be the label that is registered for use in California. So, sometimes California has more strict requirements for the use of some products than other states have. So it must be the label that's registered for use in this state. And even sometimes you'll see like a little box, on the label that says requirements for use in California, and that may be more strict than other uses. And we do want you to have the entire label. So not just this first page, but usually labels are several pages. They have a lot of information that's very useful. So you do need to have, the purpose of having the label is so that you can read it and know the proper use of the product. And the different types of information that a label contains are the required personal protective equipment, the site, and the rate. So I know a lot of you are working in park settings, so you want to know that that product is approved for use in a park setting. It may have, information like this that says, what specific weeds can be this product can be used for, and what rate you should be using for that. And so for example, Finale, it lists all these weeds that are target species that this product can be used for, and then it tells you specifically the rate of the Finale to use. When we do a pesticide use monitoring inspection, we will ask you the rate of the product. Usually you have a backpack spray, or we'll say how much product did you mix in with the water, and you should know that. Again, the target species, sometimes it's a little more broad than listing these specific species, but you just want to make sure that it's being used for what it's intended for. The label usually also has a section for environmental hazards. So if it's environmental hazards, could be rain or wind, or sometimes it'll say, do not apply this product to standing water. So you need to, know what's in that section of the label and use the product properly. And then it also has information about storage and disposal. So typically it'll say, the label will say, this container cannot be refilled, meaning once you use the product that's in that container, it needs to be properly rinsed and disposed of. You cannot refill it. And as a reminder, the label is the law. So any use of the product that is not in accordance with the label, and everything that's on the label, is a violation. So we also look at pesticide container labeling, and this is California Code of Regulations 6676. So any container that holds or has held a pesticide when it's being stored or transported shall carry the registrant's label. So as you can see, this container of Roundup Pro, it's the proper container. I would assume anytime you have pesticides, they're either being stored or transported. So it's basically anytime. And it does have the full label. Oh, I forgot to mention, for the when the requirement to have the full label, this is appropriate. I mean, the container has the full label on it. We can, in normal times, remove it, read the entire label. So this counts as having the full label. If the full label is not on the container, or even if it is, you probably want to have it printed out and kept in a binder so that you can reference it. We do accept, sorry, I'm kind of going back to the last slide, but we do accept, if you can pull up the label electronically. However, that just my personal preference, I don't prefer that. I find it, especially on a phone, it's very hard to read. And I think there are some requirements about like font size and stuff like that. So it is just easier. If you're the employer, do your employees a favor, print out a label for every product that they're using, put them in a binder, put it in their truck. Service container labeling. So a service container is defined as any container other than the original pesticide container that's used to store or transport dilute or concentrated pesticide. So here we have a backpack sprayer. This is not the original container. It's usually contains dilute pesticide, so it does have labeling requirements. And California Code of Regulations 6678 requires that it's labeled with the name and the address of the person who is responsible for the container, the name of the pesticide, and the signal word. So the signal word again would either be caution, warning, or danger. Many of the, companies and municipalities out there will just use a business card because that has your name, the address, and even your phone number on there. And then on the back, they'll put the name of the pesticide and the signal word and just laminate that and make sure it has like a hook or a zip tie or something that can be connected to the service container. If you have a pesticide, like an original pesticide container, and that registrant's label falls off, which happens, it then becomes a service container and it needs to be labeled with these items. And really that's just for safety. I don't know how often this happens, but if a service container is left behind in a park accidentally or falls out of a truck, we just want to know what's inside. And it's a protective measure for anyone who encounters a service container. So we also look for safety when we're doing a pesticide use monitoring inspection. So safety includes handler training, respiratory protection training, emergency medical care, safe equipment, protection of persons, animals, and property, and decontamination facilities. So handler training is required by California Code of Regulations 6724. This is an annual training for all employees handling pesticides. I should say annual or when a new pesticide is introduced for use. So DPR, Department of Pesticide Regulation, has specified 23 items that are required in the annual handler safety training. And like I mentioned, it's for each product that the handler is using. So, if they're using Roundup and Finale, those would be listed as pesticides that they are specifically trained to handle. If you introduce a new pesticide mid-year, you say 6 months after their training, then they would be required to be trained again. The exception to this is if the handler meets the requirements of the training through licensing. So if your employees hold a QAL or hold a QAC, that meets the requirements for the annual training. And for managers, you're required to keep these training records on file for 2 years. So some of the items that are in the handler training are how to read and understand the label. Obviously, this is very important. Like I mentioned before, the label is the law. It contains pretty much all the information you need to know about how to safely use the products, how to protect yourself, and how to protect people, animals, the environment. There could be restrictions, on what time of year you can use a certain product or how much of a product you can use within a year. So it's really important for the handlers to understand how to read and understand the label. The handler training also includes safe application of pesticides. So many of you work in parks. It is the handler's responsibility to apply a pesticide in a manner that will not result in contact with persons that are not involved with the application. So in layman's terms, you don't want to spray the public or any animals that are running around a park or any wildlife. As you know, during COVID, a lot of people are at home. They're not working in the office, so they are, on a nice sunny day, they're going to be out in a park, and they are watching you. And if they, the public in general is not aware of pesticide use regulations. They, as mentioned before, I think by Katrina, if they see you out spraying, they feel threatened, and they will call me and tell me about it. So, make sure that you're always applying this pesticides in a safe manner. The environmental concerns, is there any rain in the forecast? Is there any chance that the pesticide is going to run off into surface water? Is there any wind? Is there any potential for the pesticide to drift over onto a non-target person, species, anything, animal? And in general, this is not in the regulation, but I just recommend, if you are going to be spraying in a park where people are going to show up, just do it in the early morning. There tends to be less people there. Doing it in the middle of the day just puts you at more, at more risk of people questioning your methods. And we do get a lot of complaints. So handler training also includes the, proper PPE, how to choose PPE, safe use of PPE, how to clean contaminated and store clean PPE, routine decontamination. So I'll talk about decontamination facilities later, but just routine things like after you've handled pesticides, wash your hands before eating, drinking, using the restroom. At the end of the day, when you go home, take off your shoes before you enter your house, and then wash your clothes separate from other laundry so that if there's any residue on your clothing, it doesn't contaminate, your family's clothing. And then it also includes general first aid. The handlers will also be trained on risks and symptoms of exposure. So what are potential surfaces or ways that a handler can be exposed to a pesticide? Any treated surfaces. So, if you're spraying weeds in a field, you can get residue on your clothing or your skin. Like I said, residue on clothing, on PPE, on the equipment, or just drift. So these are all ways that a handler can be exposed unintentionally to pesticides. The pathways of exposure, so it can be absorbed through the skin, ingestion. Again, if you're handling pesticides and then you take a break to eat something, you can unintentionally ingest the pesticide, or inhalation. Handlers are also trained on emergency medical care, but I'm going to go over that later, so I will move on. Protecting you and your family, never take pesticides home. The handler training touches on the risks of pesticide exposure to children and pregnant women. And then employees' rights. So the employees have the right to receive information about pesticides that they've potentially been exposed to. They have the physician, the handler's physician has the right to receive information about pesticides that the handler has potentially been exposed to. The handler has protection against retaliatory action if they, think that they've been exposed to a pesticide and, they bring this to their employer's attention. The employer cannot retaliate. And the employee has the right to report any suspected use violations of pesticides, and those can be reported to our county ag department. So respiratory protection. So if we approach you when you're doing to do a use monitoring inspection, and we see that you're wearing respiratory protection, then these regulations kick in. Or if you're not wearing respiratory protection, but it is required by the label, then these regulations kick in as well. So basically, these regulations kick in when the respirator is required by the label or by the employer policy. There is a voluntary use exemption for filtering face pieces, and filtering face pieces in general are your N95 masks. So the employer, if there's no respiratory protection required by the label, but the employer provides an N95 filtering face piece, not the elastomeric, for voluntary use, then all of the other requirements do not kick in for the respiratory protection training. So sorry, I think I said that in a very confusing way. If the employer provides an N95 filtering face piece for voluntary use by the employees, that is fine. They just have to post a voluntary use posting that we can provide to you. And that just needs to be posted in a central location where the employees start their day. And basically that posting just kind of goes over the risks of wearing respiratory protection. However, if the employer provides a respirator that is elastomeric, then all of the training requirements kick in. So the only exemption are for the filtering face piece N95s. And I will go over the respiratory protection training requirements. So that's also an annual training or when a new respirator is introduced for use. So the training goes over how to select a respirator, how to properly use it. It does require a medical evaluation, and from what I've seen mostly used is the employees fill out an online questionnaire about their medical history, or it asks many questions, and that's submitted to a doctor, and then the doctor will evaluate if that handler can safely use a respirator. The respiratory protection training also includes fit testing, which you can see in the picture on the right, to make sure that it fits, the respirator fits properly, it's actually protecting the handler. And then also how to clean, maintain, and safely store those respirators. So we also look for emergency medical care when conducting a use monitoring inspection. And the emergency medical care is something that must be arranged in advance by the employer. And usually, as you can see on the right, it's typically, just a sheet of paper that has the name, the address, and the phone number of where that handler can seek medical attention if there's a potential exposure. So the emergency medical care is required to be posted. So whether that's at the yard where you start your day, posted in a central location, or if you are working out of your truck, it must be posted in your vehicle. So that is kind of a common violation that we see. Either the handler doesn't have any emergency medical care information, or they have it, you know, stuffed under the seat or in a binder. It is required by the regulation, California Code of Regulations 6726, to be posted. So if there is a potential exposure to pesticides, the employer is required to provide transportation to a medical facility. The handler should not be driving themselves to the medical facility. And then the employer is also required to provide to that medical facility the names of the pesticides that the handler has potentially been exposed to, the SDSs, safety data sheets, the EPA registration numbers of the products, the active ingredients, and the exposure, you know, the details of what happened, how this person was exposed. So we will also be looking for safe equipment under California Code of Regulations 6742. This regulation requires that all equipment used by employees to apply or mix and load any pesticides be in good repair and safe to use, that it's not leaking, that you have clean nozzles. So it's a good idea when you start your day before you go out in the field, you know, especially if the say you have a backpack sprayer, if it's been stored in your truck overnight, I guess if that's safe, just to look at it, make sure it's functioning properly, make sure, you know, all the gaskets are tight, there's no leaking anywhere, because it is a violation if you are not using safe equipment. Protection of persons, animals, and property. This is California Code of Regulations 6614. So you can see this, this handler applying a pesticide. It looks like in a park setting. It is the handler's responsibility to make sure that, you know, the pesticides are applied in a safe manner that does not pose a hazard to any people, any animals, or the environment. So, you know, some questions that you may want to ask yourself are there any people or animals present in the area where I'm going to be applying a pesticide? Are there any bees actively foraging? Sometimes the label will specifically address that issue. Is it windy? Is there a potential of drift? And is it raining, or is there any rain in the forecast that could result in runoff? Okay, the decontamination facility, California Code of Regulations 6734. And this has come up more often. As I mentioned, some municipalities are moving away from using using glyphosate, which is a caution material, and they may, in its place, be using a warning or danger pesticide. So when a handler is using a warning or danger pesticide, these are the requirements. It's required to have a decontamination facility within 100 feet of the mixed load site. And what a decontamination facility includes is sufficient water, sufficient soap, single-use towels, and a change of coveralls. And the requirements are different for production agriculture versus non-production agriculture. Any landscaping that you're doing in a park setting is considered non-production agriculture, and the decontamination facility is only required within 100 feet of the mixed load site. So the reason they distinguish that or make that distinction is, you know, if you're mixing and loading, you're using the concentrate, you're handling the concentrate. So that's where the biggest risk of exposure kicks in. If the mixed load site is at the yard, when you start your day, you just need to have the decontamination facility within 100 feet of, you know, where you're mixing and loading. And then take your dilute pesticide out into the field in your service container. However, if you take the concentrate of a warning or danger pesticide in your truck with you and you are mixing and loading at a park or at your destination, the truck now is your mixed load site. So in your truck, you need to have water, soap, towels, and coveralls. So I don't know, I hope I made that clear, but you can ask questions at the end if that was not clear. What does sufficient water mean? I get this question a lot. So for each handler, 3 gallons of water per day at the beginning of the day, because, you know, obviously if it's 4 p.m. and you've already, if you've, you know, something happened where you had to use your water, we're not going to require that you still have all of that water with you at the end of the day. In a park setting, we do accept a running tap. So usually if, you know, if you're at a park, there might be like a restroom facility or a operations facility that has a tap with running water. That is sufficient water, as long as the tap is working, and then you want to mix load within 100 feet of that tap, so that if you are exposed to the pesticide, you know, you can rinse off, you can rinse out your eyes. So for eye flushing, right now, what do they call that? The eye flushing like bottle is not required by regulation for non-production agriculture. So it's not required for what you're doing. However, we do highly recommend it. Again, you're working with the concentrate of the pesticide. It's most likely to affect your eyes when you're mixing and loading it. So, you know, eye flushing is highly recommended. This California Code of Regulation that addresses decontamination facilities is under review by DPR, and it will be open for public comment soon. So if you have any input, you know, this is your time to make those concerns heard. I should mention also that all the items that are required but in a decontamination facility must be stored together, so that if a handler is mixing and loading, they don't have to go over here for water and then the soap is 100 feet the other way. Everything needs to be stored together. Okay, and then the fourth category of things that we look at in a use monitoring inspection is storage. So pesticide storage, how are the containers stored? How are they transported? And correct PPE storage. Sorry, I'm gonna hurry up a little bit. I'm getting a little behind. So California Code of Regulations 6680 prohibits any pesticides from being stored in food, drink, or household product containers. So never put any pesticide in a coffee can, in a milk jug, in a Tupperware, or in a Gatorade bottle. It's not safe. It leads to accidents. So none of these. pesticides should only be stored in the original containers in a service container that's properly labeled. We're going to be checking to see that your if you are handling pesticides, that your containers are secured and attended according to California Code of Regulations 6670. So the under this regulation, it applies to all containers or equipment that holds or has held pesticides. The handler is responsible for maintaining control over these containers as to prevent contact by unauthorized persons. So all containers need to be within your eye shot, and if you're going to leave the containers in an area that you can't supervise them and maintain control, then you need to lock them up. Proper pesticide transport. California Code of Regulations 6682 states that pesticides should not be transported in a compartment with persons, food, or feed. So under most circumstances, this means do not put them in your cab. Likewise, do not put food in your pesticide compartment where you're storing the pesticides in the back of the truck. PPE needs to be stored properly. So basically it calls out clean PPE because, contaminated PPE needs to be dealt with in a separate way. It needs to be, cleaned and maintained. But for all your clean PPE, keep it separate from your personal clothing and store it in a clean and pesticide-free, specifically designated place. So do not store your PPE in your truck, in the back of your truck with the pesticides. Some people use these sealable containers. Throw your gloves in there, and then they can be stored safely. Okay, I want to go over this. So this affects many municipalities. We've been seeing it out there more and more. If a municipality is contracting a landscape business to, maintain their landscaping, and they're performing pest control in a right-of-way, park, golf course, cemetery, or nursery, they must be licensed by California Department of Pesticide Regulation as an agricultural pest control business. They cannot be licensed as a maintenance gardener business. So a maintenance gardener business license allows a business to perform pest control that's incidental to their main business. So their main business is gardening. They're allowed to spray in a way that's incidental to that business. An agricultural pest control business license allows the company to, perform pest control as described here. And I'm going to go over, I pulled up the definitions. So there are different agricultural pest control business license categories. In order to spray in parks or right-of-ways or streets, the business must be licensed in the category of B, landscape maintenance, or C, right-of-ways. So they just changed the landscape maintenance category B definition to include streets. And then the category C, right-of-way, includes roads, highways, pipelines, railroads, and landscaped right-of-ways area. So if you're hiring a landscape business to do your work for you, they need to have an AgPCB license issued by DPR in the category B or C. And how do you know that they are licensed this way? This is an example of a pest control business license. You can see at the top it says pest control business. And then if a business is licensed as a pest control business, they are required to have a QAL, which, you know, oh, I don't know what I did. DPR does that work for you. So this is an example of a QAL that in the category of B, C, and E. So they are covered. Okay, so I don't know if we can bring up the poll or not, but I was going to ask what you think the most common violations are.
Yeah, we'll bring it up.
Okay. Okay, so when the county ag inspector is out there doing a use monitoring inspection, what do you think the most common violation is that we find? And I ran these numbers over the last 5 years, so I don't know if that really changes anything, but. Okay, so 68% of you think the most common violation is PPE. Let me close this. And you are correct. That is our #1 violation. It's the most obvious one, you know, because we can just tell by looking at you if you have the at least the regulatory PPE, the eye protection and the gloves. So don't be this guy. You can see, you know, like I said before, at a minimum, the label usually requires long pants and long sleeve shirt. So is he wearing a long sleeve shirt? Probably, but he has the sleeves rolled up. I think the eye protection's on the back of his head and no gloves. So yes, that is our #1 violation. And I would say even more commonly, it's the eye protection. I get feedback that, you know, especially now with people wearing COVID mask protection, they say their glasses fog up. You're going to have to find a way to work around that because, you know, regardless of the mask, the eye protection is required. And the gloves, you know, it needs to be the proper type of gloves and they need to be on your hands. So if they're in your truck, they're not protecting you. So the next #2 violation is the emergency medical care. And it's usually because it's not posted. Remember that the requirement is that it's posted. Service container labeling. I know these fall off or they're just forgotten. So make sure that they are correct and attached to the service container and having the registered label of the product that you're using. And this was already gone over in detail. I'm very glad because DPR came out with an enforcement letter that prohibits and under most circumstances the use of 2nd-generation anticoagulant rodenticides with these 4 active ingredients. And please don't make me pronounce them because I can't. But yeah, they're prohibited for use in parks, which applies to most of your work. There are some narrow exemptions for government agencies, but it's mostly, you know, for vector control if there's a public health crisis, invasive species on islands. So I don't think that would affect any of you. So yeah, the exemptions are very narrow. They still can be used in some agriculture settings. But for non-production agriculture, they're basically prohibited. And we, let me see what time it is.
We have time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't even know how much this enforcement letter will affect any of you, but it is as of January 1st, 2021. So we're already, under the prohibitions. I don't know. I don't have my notes in front of me, but we can provide a copy of the enforcement letter. The enforcement letter also has some really good FAQs on it. So in this situation, can I use it? Or if you have these products in your possession and you want to get rid of them, the FAQ does say, if the products are still sealed, you might be able to return it to the manufacturer. Otherwise, we can put you in touch with environmental health to get rid of those safely. I think it's environmental health. I feel like I'm not saying enough about that, but I know that it was covered extensively. So, but if you have any questions, please let me know. This is our contact information. So I'm happy to take any questions.